The Supreme Court chamber went silent when Representative Jasmine Crockett entered the room. Her bright emerald green suit was jarring against the dark wood paneling. All eyes locked onto her confidence as she approached the witness table directly across from Justice Clarence Thomas. The air was electric, with reporters' pens frantically scribbling against their notebooks, while spectators shifted nervously in their seats. It wasn't supposed to go this way. A freshman congresswoman going toe-to-toe with the most senior Supreme Court justice in a historic congressional oversight hearing. Just a few moments earlier, Thomas had seemingly delivered a knockout blow to the committee, smugly declaring Congress had no authority to question the ethics of Supreme Court justices. His supporters nodded approvingly, feeling the matter was settled. But Crockett, a former accomplished trial attorney herself, seemed unbothered. She opened her portfolio with deliberateness, revealing a single page with text highlighted on it. The chamber grew even quieter as she adjusted the microphone, a slight smile playing at her lips. This wasn't just any congressional hearing. It was the first Supreme Court ethics investigation in history, after months of explosive reporting about luxury trips and undisclosed gifts, potential conflicts of interest. And now Representative Crockett was about to ask Thomas a single question that her team of lawyers had spent weeks crafting, one that would expose decades of ethical violations or fall completely flat on national television. He announced the gentlewoman from Texas has 5 minutes to question the witness. Crockett leaned forward, locked eyes with Thomas, and prepared to flip the entire hearing upside down. Justice Clarence Thomas sat stoically at the witness table, his 33 years on the nation's highest court evident in his commanding presence. At 75, he was the longest-serving current justice, appointed by President George H.W. Bush in 1991. After one of the most contentious confirmation hearings in American history, he had cultivated a reputation as a conservative jurist who spoke rarely during oral arguments and prized quiet authority. Today, however, he had been anything but quiet, forcefully defending himself in the court against what he called unprecedented congressional overreach. The Constitution established 3 co-equal branches of government. Thomas had stated earlier, his deep voice resounding through the chamber. The judiciary independence is not a privilege. It is constitutional necessity. His supporters in the room nodded vigorously, seeing him as the defender of judicial autonomy against political interference. Republican members of the committee had spent their questioning time letting Thomas expound on the importance of an independent judiciary freed from congressional meddling. Across from ISAT, Representative Jasmine Crockett, just 42 years old and barely in her second year in Congress. The former criminal defense attorney and civil rights lawyer from Dallas had quickly made a name for herself with her sharp legal questioning and unwillingness to back down from powerful figures. Her election was historic. She was part of the most diverse freshman class in congressional history. Despite her newcomer status in Washington, Crockett had earned her spot on this high-profile committee through her legal expertise and fearless demeanor in previous hearings. Representative Crockett has the floor for 5 minutes, announced Chairman Johnson, a moderate Republican who had reluctantly convened these historic hearings after months of public pressure. The room was packed with dignitaries, journalists, and members of the public who had waited overnight for a seat. In the gallery sat Crockett's elderly parents, her father, a Vietnam veteran, and her mother, a retired school teacher, watching their daughter prepare to question a Supreme Court justice. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This hearing came after a series of damaging reports about lavish gifts, luxury travel, and property deals involving several justices, with Thomas receiving the most scrutiny. ProPublica had revealed that Thomas had accepted but never disclosed millions in luxury trips from billionaire Republican donor Harlan Crow, including holidays on private jets, super yachts, and exclusive resorts. Further investigations uncovered real estate deals and school tuition payments that raised serious ethical concerns. For Thomas, this hearing threatened to tarnish his legacy and perhaps force the creation of an enforceable ethics code for the Supreme Court, something the justices had resisted for decades. For Crockett, this was a defining career moment that could either establish her as a rising star in American politics or label her as an overly ambitious junior representative who overreached against a towering legal figure. Throughout the hearing, Thomas had successfully parried questions from senior Democrats, dismissing concerns with technical legal arguments and assertions of judicial independence. Several veteran lawmakers had already tried and failed to corner him on the ethics issues. Now all eyes were on Crockett as she adjusted her papers, took a sip of water, and prepared to begin her questioning. The clock was ticking on her 5-minute allocation. Justice Thomas, she began, her voice calm, but carrying clearly through the chamber. Thank you for being here today. Thomas nodded slightly, the same practice response he had given to every other committee member. But Crockett's next words caused him to freeze. I'd like to ask you a single question about Article Roman 3, Section 1 of the Constitution, the very section you cited repeatedly today as protecting judicial independence. Crockett continued, her Texas drawl slightly more pronounced as she leaned toward the microphone. You stated multiple times that Article Roman 3 protects the Supreme Court from congressional oversight. You suggested that this committee's very existence threatens judicial independence. She paused, letting her words hang in the air. The room remained completely silent, with even the usual shuffling and Wiserus absent. Thomas nodded confidently. That is correct, Congresswoman. The separation of powers is fundamental to our constitutional system. I agree that separation of powers is essential, Crockett replied. So essential that I've spent considerable time studying Article Roman 3. She lifted the document from her portfolio, a printed copy of the Constitution with highlighted sections. Would you mind if I read the exact language from Article Roman 3, Section 1? Please do, Thomas said, his expression unchanged, but his posture stiffening slightly. Crockett read clearly. The judges, both of the Supreme and inferior courts, shall hold their offices during good behavior, and shall at stated times receive for their services a compensation which shall not be diminished during their continuance in office. She looked up from her notes at Justice Thomas. That's the entirety of the constitutional protection of judicial independence, tenure during good behavior, and protection of salary. Thomas began to respond, but Crockett pressed on. Throughout this hearing, you've referred to the Federalist Papers concerning judicial independence. I have studied those too. She pulled another piece of paper out of her folder. In Federalist 79, Alexander Hamilton writes, while absolute salary protection exists, the good behavior provision explicitly creates a mechanism for accountability. A little mumbling started in the crowd. Thomas's expression did not change, but his brow furrowed. The Republican committee members were uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. Chairman Johnson tapped his gavel lightly. Please let the witness respond. Congresswoman Thomas began the tradition of judicial independence extends beyond the literal text. I am quite familiar with your textualist approach to constitutional interpretation. As Thomas Crockett continued, you have often said that the Constitution should not be interpreted beyond its original public meaning, not expanded by unwritten tradition. Isn't that correct? A few gasps were audible in the chamber. Thomas's colleagues on the court were known to accuse liberal justices of creating rights not explicitly in the Constitution. And here was Crockett using Thomas's own judicial philosophy against him. Thomas cleared his throat. Yes, I believe in adhering to the text as understood at the time of ratification. Excellent, Crockett nodded. Then we can agree that the text of Article Roman 3 contains no explicit prohibition against congressional oversight of the judiciary. In fact, the Constitution gives Congress significant power over the court, determining the number of justices, establishing jurisdiction, and even impeaching justices for failing to maintain good behavior. She paused to let this sink in, then shifted her approach. Justice Thomas, let's turn to the matter of financial disclosures. The Ethics in Government Act requires all federal judges to disclose gifts. According to ProPublica's reporting, you've accepted but not disclosed private school tuition for your grandnephew, luxury travel worth millions, and real estate transactions with wealthy donors who have had interest before the court. Thomas's jaw tightened. Those reports contain numerous inaccuracies, and the disclosure requirements have changed over time. Respectfully, Justice Thomas, the requirement to disclose gifts has been consistent since 1978. Crockett counter. She held up another document. This is your own disclosure form which explicitly requires reporting of gifts aggregating more than $415. There's no exception for friends, Chairman Johnson interjected. The gentlewoman has 1 minute remaining. Crockett nodded, then turned back to Thomas. Justice Thomas shifted in his seat as Representative Crockett laid the groundwork with precision. She cited recent disclosures: a $1,200 pair of designer earrings, and $1,800 carved sculpture. Then she paused and raised the contrast. Yet you did not disclose private jet flights valued at roughly $500,000 each, she said, or vacations on super yachts renting for $750,000 per week. Camera shutters erupted. Thomas visibly stiffened. Those fell under the personal hospitality exception, he began. Crockett corrected him calmly. The personal hospitality exception applies to staying in someone's home. Not private jets, not luxury resorts. Then she leaned forward. And this brings me to my actual question. The room went quiet, unnaturally quiet. If you believe in textualism, and if the Constitution requires judges to maintain good behavior, what specific legal standard are you using to conclude that secretly accepting millions in undisclosed gifts from parties with interests before the court qualifies as good behavior as the founders understood it? The chamber exploded. Gas, rapid typing, lawmakers talking over one another. Chairman Johnson pounded his gavel. Order, order. Thomas sat frozen. The trap was perfect. If he claimed there was no standard, he would undermine textualism itself. If he created one to justify his conduct, he would be inventing an exception, something he had spent decades condemning. After a long pause, Thomas spoke. The meaning of good behavior must be understood in historical context. Excellent, Crockett replied, already lifting a document. A letter from George Washington reminding justices they must be free from influence. Another from Thomas Jefferson warning judges must avoid even the suspicion of financial interest. By the founder's own words, she said, financial independence was essential to judicial integrity. Legal experts in the audience nodded. Constitutional scholars began posting online in real time. The gentlewoman's time has expired, Chairman Johnson called. But Crockett was ready. Point of inquiry. The witness's time expired when mine did. I asked for a legal standard, not commentary. She repeated it slowly. What specific legal standard defines good behavior in a way that permits undisclosed gifts worth millions from interested parties? Silence. For the first time, Justice Thomas seemed genuinely lost. He shuffled papers, drank water, then conceded. Good behavior does not have an express constitutional definition. It has traditionally been shaped by congressional and judicial practice. Crockett nodded. So Congress has a role in defining and enforcing judicial standards of good behavior. The implication hit instantly. Thomas had conceded on the record that Congress has constitutional authority over Supreme Court ethics. The room erupted again. Recess, 15 minutes. Chairman Johnson's gavel came down hard. Cameras captured the moment, Thomas whispering urgently to counsel. Republicans huddled, Crockett calmly collecting her papers. Outside the hearing room, the reaction was immediate. Crockett Question trended nationally. Analysts called it the most consequential questioning of a justice in decades. She forced Thomas into an impossible dilemma. One commentator said, abandon textualism or admit Congress's authority. When the hearing resumed, the balance had shifted. Thomas appeared defensive. Republicans pivoted to procedural distractions, but the damage was done. Clips spread everywhere. Law professors assigned the transcript. Headlines followed. Crockett corners, Thomas on constitutional ethics. Freshman lawmaker delivers historic exchange. Justice concedes congressional role in ethics oversight. Even conservative voices acknowledge the brilliance of the questioning, if not its implications. By nightfall, one thing was clear. The debate over Supreme Court ethics had changed, not because of shouting, not because of spectacle, but because one question used a justice's own philosophy and left him nowhere to stand. Thomas has been the court's most forceful advocate for judicial independence, noted a Supreme Court correspondent, and his inability to answer Crockett's question undermines that advocacy in a profound way. As was expected, the rest of the Supreme Court justices remained publicly silent on the issue, but sources close to the court reported that several justices were troubled privately by what it could portend. One described an unnamed liberal justice as saying, "This could finally force us to establish the formal ethics code we've avoided for decades." A conservative justice reportedly worried that congressional overreach would be normalized if we don't respond effectively. In another context entirely, for Crockett, the hearing whisked her from promising freshman representative to national political figure overnight. Her office was inundated with interview requests, speaking invitations, and, most tellingly, campaign contributions. Political analysts began speculating about her future prospects, Senate seat, cabinet position, or even higher office. "We're watching the birth of a political star," said one Democratic strategist. "She is the rare combination of substantive legal expertise and charismatic communication skills." Several concrete developments came in the days after the hearing. First, Chairman Johnson announced that his committee would draft legislation establishing a formal ethics code for the Supreme Court, something that had been talked about for years but never gained traction. Second, two additional Supreme Court justices filed amended financial disclosure forms, seemingly in an effort to get in front of any similar scrutiny. Third, the Supreme Court's Public Information Office released a brief statement that the court was reviewing its internal ethics guidelines and disclosure practices. Probably most important, public polling revealed a dramatic shift in attitudes about Supreme Court accountability. Before the hearing, only 34% of Americans thought Congress had a role to play in Supreme Court ethics. After Crockett's questioning and Thomas's response went viral, that number jumped to 58%. The shift was especially marked among independents and moderate Republicans, many of whom were taken in by Crockett's textualist constitutional argument. "This is going to be in constitutional law textbooks for generations," predicted one prominent scholar. Crockett managed to use originalist and textualist methods, usually associated with conservative legal thought, to make a compelling case for congressional oversight of judicial ethics. Fascinating case study in constitutional interpretation. The long-term effects were unknown, but would this pave the way for meaningful reform of practices related to Supreme Court ethics? Would it change the relative balance of power between the legislative and judicial branches? Would it alter how justices approach questions of institutional independence in future cases? Only time could answer that. But one thing was clear. A tectonic shift had finally occurred in how many Americans perceived accountability in the Supreme Court. To Crockett personally, the moment was both opportunity and challenge. "I did not come to Congress to become famous," she told the hometown Texas newspaper in her only interview after the hearing. "I came to uphold the Constitution and to serve the people in my district." This moment is significant, not because of me, but because it reminds us that in our democracy, no one is above accountability, not even a justice on the Supreme Court. As the news cycle inevitably moved to other stories, the substantive impact of Crockett's question continued to reverberate through America's institutions. Legal scholars debated its implications in academia. Proposals to reform ethics gained steam in Congress. The Supreme Court commenced internal discussions about codifying its practices related to ethical behavior. And at law schools across the country, feature lawyers studied the exchange as a masterclass in constitutional argumentation. "Sometimes a single well-crafted question can change the course of constitutional history," wrote a respected legal historian a month after the hearing. Representative Crockett's question to Justice Thomas may prove to be such a moment not because it was politically charged or created viral content, but because it laid bare a fundamental tension in our constitutional system that can no longer be ignored. That tension between judicial independence and accountability, between textualism and unwritten traditions, between institutional power and democratic oversight, always ran beneath the surface of American governance. But Crockett's incisive questioning brought it into sharp focus and forced Americans from across the political spectrum to grapple with the fundamental constitutional question. What precisely constitutes good behavior for those entrusted with the nation's highest judicial power? Perhaps the most critical influence, therefore, he was not in fact what took place within Washington, but what transpired around living rooms and classrooms throughout the country, where citizens were re-engaging with their Constitution and the new delicate balance of powers that undergirds American democracy. In 5 minutes of questioning, Representative Jasmine Crockett had not only interrogated the justice, She had invited a nation to reconsider the very premise of its criminal justice system.